The nurse thought I was asleep. I wasn't. I was staring at the ceiling tile with the water stain shaped like a comma, counting my own breaths, because counting was the only thing keeping me upright 4 hours after they'd cut my daughter out of me. That's when my husband's phone lit up on the tray table beside my hospital bed. He'd gone to get coffee. He hadn't taken it with him. I wasn't going to look. I want that on record. I have never been a woman who goes through other people's phones. But the screen stayed lit, and the name at the top of the message wasn't one I recognized, and the first line was enough. She better not ruin Paris for us. Tell me she's not going to be like this the whole time. I read it twice, then a third time, in case the drugs were doing something to my eyes. They weren't. I set the phone back down exactly where it had been, screen dimming on its own, and I folded my hands over the blanket covering my stomach, over the staples, over everything. His mother arrived 20 minutes later, took my daughter from the bassinet without asking, and told the nurse at the station, loud enough for me to hear through the half-open door, that I was too emotional right now to bond properly. I didn't correct her. I didn't cry either. The next morning, discharge day, I signed every form they put in front of me. My hand was steady, my voice was pleasant. Nobody in that room had any idea that the night before, while my husband was down the hall calling someone who wasn't me, my OB had quietly pressed an envelope into my hand and said 4 words I haven't stopped thinking about since. You should see this. I hadn't opened it yet, but I already knew, somehow, that everything in my life was about to change, and that I was the only one who was going to see it coming. My name is Naomi Whitfield, and 3 years before that hospital room, I was the kind of woman who apologized when other people bumped into her. I met Daniel at a fundraiser I hadn't wanted to attend. He was charming in the specific way that men are charming when they've never had to try very hard at anything. Good posture, good teeth, a laugh that arrived half a second before the joke landed. His family owned Whitfield & Cole, a mid-sized architecture firm that had been quietly profitable for 2 generations. Mine owned nothing but a modest house in Ohio and a lot of unpaid overtime. I told myself the class difference didn't matter. I was good at telling myself things. We married 18 months later, in a ceremony his mother, Eleanor, planned almost entirely without me, right down to the flowers I supposedly loved. I let it go. I let a lot of things go in those early years. The way Eleanor corrected my table manners at Thanksgiving, the way Daniel's sister Priya referred to me as Daniel's wife instead of by name at company events, the way my own career as a structural engineer got quietly folded into helping out at the firm whenever anyone introduced me to a client. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things. What I didn't tell myself, because I didn't yet know it, was that Daniel had been seeing a woman named Vivian Castellano for almost a year. Vivian worked in the firm's marketing department. She was 29, unmarried and, I would later learn, deeply unbothered by the fact that Daniel had a wife who was 7 months pregnant at the time their relationship began. I found out by accident, the way most wives do. Not through a lipstick stain or a suspicious receipt, but through something smaller and stupider. A shared calendar. Daniel had, at some point, given me access to his work calendar so I could help coordinate the renovation of our house. Buried between client meetings, there was a recurring event, every Thursday at 6, titled simply, Dinner. No location, no other guests. I didn't confront him. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't naivety. It was arithmetic. I was 31 weeks pregnant, financially entangled with a man whose family controlled both our joint accounts and the firm where I'd once had my own name on the door, and I had exactly 1 card to play if I moved too early, the element of surprise. So I watched. I learned that Vivian didn't know I existed as anything more than an inconvenience Daniel was managing. I learned that Eleanor knew about the affair, had known for months, and had said nothing to me, not out of loyalty to her son exactly, but because she'd never fully approved of me, and some small, ugly part of her seemed almost relieved. I learned, from a document I wasn't supposed to see, that Daniel had quietly begun the process of restructuring his shares in Whitfield and Cole, moving assets in a way that looked, to my engineer's eye, exactly like a man preparing for a divorce he hadn't yet mentioned to his wife. I said nothing. I smiled at dinners. I let Eleanor plan the nursery colors. I let Priya make her comments about how I'd gotten so quiet lately, almost like the old Naomi. The old Naomi wouldn't have made an appointment with a family law attorney under her maiden name. The old Naomi wouldn't have spent her third trimester quietly photographing financial documents on her phone during the 10 minutes Daniel left his study unlocked each morning. The old Naomi definitely wouldn't have called Dr. Patricia Nguyen, my OB, and, it turned out, someone who had seen far more in 20 years of practice than she ever let on, and asked her, carefully, hypothetically, what a woman in my position should know before she gave birth. I went into labor on a Tuesday. Daniel was at a client dinner. He arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after our daughter, Clara, was born, still smelling faintly of a restaurant I didn't recognize, already texting someone under the table. I watched him do it. I watched the words appear on his screen, before he even looked up at me. That was the night everything I had quietly gathered for 11 months stopped being insurance, and started being a plan. Dr. Nguyen came to see me the evening before discharge, ostensibly to check the incision. She drew the curtain most of the way and lowered her voice in a manner that had nothing to do with medical privacy. "I've delivered babies for a lot of women in this hospital," she said, adjusting the blanket over Clara without quite looking at me. "Some of them come back years later and tell me things about the men who were in the room, or weren't, things about what the mothers-in-law said when they thought the new mom was too sedated to hear." I said nothing. I'd learned that silence pulled more information out of people than questions did. "Eleanor Whitfield was very interested in your discharge paperwork," she continued. "Asked one of the residents whether postpartum patients are considered fully competent to sign legal documents. Asked specifically about power of attorney forms. She finally met my eyes. I don't know what's going on in your marriage, Naomi, and it isn't my business, but I've seen this particular shape of thing before, so I made some calls." She handed me the envelope then. Inside was a single sheet, the name and number of a nurse practitioner turned patient advocate who, Dr. Nguyen explained, specialized in exactly one thing, helping women document, discreetly and legally, any attempt to leverage their postpartum state against their competency or their custody rights. There was also a business card for a family law attorney who did not, as it happened, share a country club membership with anyone named Whitfield. "You don't have to use it," Dr. Nguyen said, "but you should have it before tomorrow morning." I didn't sleep that night, not because of Clara's feeding schedule, but because I was doing math. Eleanor had asked about power of attorney. That meant someone, Eleanor, or Daniel, or both, was already thinking several moves ahead of grief and coffee and casserole dishes. They weren't planning a comforting homecoming. They were planning a narrative, one where an overwhelmed, unstable new mother might be gently, lovingly, guided toward decisions that weren't fully her own. I thought about the shared calendar. I thought about the shifted shares in the firm. I thought about the attorney I'd already quietly retained under my maiden name 6 weeks earlier, a sharp, unshowy woman named Ruth Okafor who had told me, on our first call, "The people who win these things are never the loudest in the room. They're the ones with the paper trail." I had a paper trail. I'd been building one for 11 months without fully admitting to myself what it was for. Discharge morning, Eleanor arrived before Daniel did, dressed as though she were attending a luncheon rather than collecting a grandchild. She held Clara the entire time the nurse walked me through the paperwork, narrating little observations to no one in particular. She seems so tired, doesn't she? New mothers really shouldn't be making big decisions right now. I just want to make sure everything's handled properly for her. I signed the standard discharge forms. I did not sign the additional document Eleanor produced from her handbag, a temporary caregiving arrangement, she called it, drafted by a friend who's a lawyer, granting her expanded authority over Clara's medical decisions just until Naomi's back on her feet. I think I'll read this more carefully at home, I said, and slid it, unsigned, into my own bag. Something flickered across Eleanor's face. Not anger exactly. Recalculation. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later with a bouquet of white peonies and an apology for being late that had nothing to do with where he'd actually been. He kissed my forehead. He held Clara like a man in a commercial for life insurance. And as he helped me into the wheelchair for the mandatory ride to the exit, his phone buzzed once in his jacket pocket, and I watched his hand move to silence it without breaking his smile. I smiled back at him the whole way to the car. It was, I realized, disturbingly easy. The first 3 weeks home taught me more about my marriage than the previous 3 years had. Daniel was attentive in the specific way men are attentive when they are managing something. He brought me tea I hadn't asked for. He took the night shifts with Clara that made him look, to anyone watching, like a devoted new father, and then slept until noon the next day, while I handled everything else. Eleanor visited almost daily, always with a reason, a casserole, a onesie Clara needed, a gentle suggestion that perhaps I should let her take Clara for a few hours so I could rest properly. I said yes to some of it, not because I trusted her, but because Ruth had been clear on the phone. Don't refuse things that look reasonable. Refusing reasonable things makes you look like the unstable one. Just document everything. So I documented everything. I kept a log, dates, times, exact phrasing, of every comment Eleanor made about my emotional state. Every time Daniel implied to a friend or relative that I'd been having a hard time adjusting. I forwarded myself screenshots. I saved voicemails. Ruth had taught me that in family court, a pattern was worth more than a single dramatic incident. 100 small stones build a wall better than one boulder. It was during week 3 that Priya called me. I want to be clear that Priya and I had never been close. She'd spent most of our acquaintance treating me like an HR problem her brother had created. So when she asked to meet for coffee, alone, without Daniel or Eleanor knowing, I assumed it was another performance. It wasn't. I need to tell you something, she said, turning her cup in slow circles without drinking from it. And I need you to understand, I'm telling you because of Clara, not because I suddenly like you. She told me that Vivian wasn't the first. That there had been someone 2 years earlier, a woman from a client's firm, and that Eleanor had known about that one too, and had helped Daniel manage the situation, Priya's words, by quietly moving money the wife's lawyer never found. That Eleanor didn't do this out of blind maternal love. She did it because Whitfield & Cole's biggest client, a real estate developer named Marcus Hale, was deeply, old-fashionedly conservative about family values in his business partners, and a second divorce scandal attached to Daniel would cost the firm a contract worth, by Priya's estimate, several $1 million. She's not protecting Daniel, Priya said. She's protecting the Hale contract. If you go quietly, she'll make sure you're comfortable. If you make noise, she will bury you, and she has the money and the lawyers to do it. I asked Priya why she was telling me this. She was quiet for a long moment. Because I have a daughter too, she finally said. And I watched what this family did to the last woman who got in the way. I'm not doing that again. I thanked her. I didn't tell her about Ruth, or the documents, or the calendar screenshots, or the 6 weeks I'd already spent quietly restructuring my own finances into an account Daniel didn't know existed. Priya had given me something valuable, the Hale contract, a pressure point I hadn't known about. But I had learned, over 11 months, that trust was a currency I could no longer spend freely, not even on family who seemed to be on my side. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I opened my laptop and started a new document. At the top, I typed a single line. Marcus Hale, Family Values Clause. Does he know? Underneath it, I began to write everything down. It took another 5 weeks to build what Ruth called a case that closes doors instead of opening arguments. I learned, through a contact of Priya's, who worked in the Hale organization's compliance office, that Marcus Hale's contracts with vendor firms did in fact include a personal conduct clause, boilerplate language about reputational alignment that Whitfield and Cole's leadership had used, unofficially, to screen out contractors with public scandals. It wasn't illegal for me to know this. It also wasn't something Eleanor wanted anyone to know I knew. I didn't go to Marcus Hale. That would have been the loud move, and loud moves lose. Instead, I went to Ruth, and Ruth built a settlement proposal so precise it barely needed explaining twice. The custody terms were non-negotiable in my favor, built on 11 months of documented behavior, the calendar, the voicemails, Eleanor's attempted power of attorney maneuver on discharge day, witnessed and timestamped by 2 hospital staff members Dr. Nguyen quietly connected me with. The financial terms accounted for the shares Daniel had moved during my pregnancy, which Ruth's forensic accountant traced back through 3 shell transfers to an account still, technically, considered marital property. And at the bottom, in language so calm it barely read as a threat, was a single clause noting that any contest of these terms would require both parties' full financial and personal history to be entered into the public record, including, though not naming him directly, matters relevant to third-party business relationships currently under confidentiality agreements. Ruth mailed it to Daniel's attorney on a Thursday. I know because I checked the calendar. Dinner was still there, same time, same lack of location. Right through the week the papers landed. Daniel called me that Thursday night, and for the first time in 3 years, his voice didn't have the practiced ease I'd married. "What is this?" he said. "Not a question, an accusation." "It's what happens next," I said. "My mother is going to lose her mind." "Your mother already knew about Vivian 2 years before this one," I said, "and the one before that. I think she'll manage." There was a long silence on the line, and then, quieter, "You could have just told me you knew." "I did tell you," I said. "You just weren't listening. I've been telling you since the hospital, Daniel. You just assumed I was too tired to notice." He didn't have anything to say to that. Eleanor called the next morning, and I let it go to voicemail, and then I listened to it twice, because Ruth had taught me that voicemails were evidence too. Her voice had none of its usual composure. She used the word ungrateful. She used the word vindictive. She did not, notably, deny anything Priya had told me, or anything in the settlement documents, because there was nothing left to deny. 2 weeks later, his attorney had run the numbers on a contested custody battle involving hospital witnesses and a paper trail 11 months deep, and concluded, correctly, that there was no version of a fight that ended well for him. Marcus Hale never had to hear a word about any of it. That silence was, in its own way, the most expensive thing Eleanor Whitfield ever paid for. I held Clara that night in the apartment I'd secretly leased 4 months earlier under my maiden name, and for the first time since the fluorescent lights of that hospital room, I let myself cry, not from grief, but from the strange, unfamiliar weight of my own hands being finally, fully mine again. The firm's holiday party, 6 months later, was the first time I saw all of them in the same room since the settlement. I hadn't been invited, not officially, but Priya had, and Priya had asked if I'd come as her guest, So Clara's aunt can actually hold her niece in public for once. I said yes. Not for drama, because Clara deserved a family that showed up for her honestly, even if it was only half a family, even if the other half was still learning what honesty cost. Eleanor saw me first. I watched something pass over her face, not quite the recalculation from discharge morning, but close. She'd lost the Hale contract renewal 18 months later anyway. I'd heard through Priya, after Marcus Hale's own daughter went through a difficult divorce, and he'd developed, apparently, rather strong feelings about firms that quietly protected men instead of families. Nobody ever said my name in connection with it. Nobody needed to. Vivian wasn't there. I heard she and Daniel hadn't lasted past that spring, that Paris, when it finally happened, had been a colder trip than either of them expected. Two people who'd built an entire relationship around the excitement of hiding it, discovering they had very little left once there was nothing left to hide. Daniel approached me near the drinks table, Clara asleep against my shoulder in her little green dress. He looked older than 34. He looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like he was actually seeing me. "She's gotten so big," he said. "She does that," I said. He hesitated, turning his glass in his hands the way Priya once turned her coffee cup. "I never really understood what happened," he said quietly. "How you just knew. How you built all of that without me noticing." "You weren't supposed to notice," I said. That was rather the point. "Do you hate me?" I thought about the honest answer, the one Ruth had told me I never owed anyone, least of all him. "I don't think about you enough to hate you, Daniel. I think about her." I looked down at Clara. Everything I did, so she'd grow up with a mother who wasn't afraid, and a father who had to actually earn his place in her life instead of assuming it. You get to be part of that if you want to be. That part's still up to you. He didn't have an answer for that, and for once, I didn't need him to. I left before midnight. My firm, the small structural engineering practice I'd quietly rebuilt using my maiden name and the severance Ruth had negotiated, had a client meeting early the next morning, the kind of meeting I used to sit outside of, taking notes for a husband who took the credit. Now I sat at the head of the table. Clara stirred in her sleep as I buckled her into the car seat, one small hand closing around my finger the way it had the very first night, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and unspoken things. I sat there a moment longer than I needed to, just feeling the weight of her hand in mine, the quiet, ordinary miracle of a life that was, finally, entirely honest. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you, if you've ever had to stay calm while you quietly rebuilt everything they thought they'd taken from you, this story was for you. If it meant something, stay a while longer, subscribe, and I'll tell you the next one.